The third-floor office of Kessler Regional Medical Center looked out over a parking structure, and beyond it, a narrow strip of November sky the color of old chalk. Dr. Adrian Kessler stood at the window with her arms crossed, not watching the sky. She was watching the reflection of the man standing behind her in the glass. "Mr. Sadler," she said, "the hospital cannot carry staff who don't show up. Your position ends today, effective immediately." Owen Sadler stood 4 feet from her desk, green scrubs, clean, forearms that had learned to stay still. He was 38 years old, and he had the posture of a man who had spent years lifting people who could not lift themselves. He did not explain himself. He did not ask which part of the record she had read. He looked at her for 3 seconds the way a person memorizes a detail they will need later. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out. The door latched behind him. Adrian uncrossed her arms. She stood at the window and looked at the parking structure and tried to name the thing happening in her chest. She could not. She told herself it was relief. The board had been watching her for 6 months with the particular attention of people who are waiting to see if a woman will blink. She had not blinked, she told herself that. To understand why he didn't say a single word in his own defense, you have to go back 9 hours. At 5:40 in the morning, the kitchen of a rental house in Millbrook was warm from the oven. Owen stood at the counter in clean scrubs he'd ironed the night before, cutting an apple into eighths the way his daughter liked, the core gone, the skin left on because she'd told him the skin was the best part and he had no argument for that. Sophie was 7. She had her mother's gap between her front teeth and a way of standing in doorways like she was deciding whether a room was worth entering. She came out of her bedroom holding a permission slip with the signature line blank. "Daddy," she said, "it's for the science fair. You have to sign it before 8. Owen dried his hands and signed his name and gave her the apple in a zip bag. She sat at the counter and examined each slice before eating it. He had planned to leave at 6:15. Sophie's bus came at 7. His mother-in-law Greta watched her until then, 3 mornings a week, in the apartment above the hardware store on Route 9. But that Tuesday Greta had called at 5 to say she had a fever and couldn't come. Owen had called the backup, a neighbor named Beth who didn't pick up. He had called the school office and asked about late drop-off. He had called his shift supervisor, Raymond, who had not picked up either. He left a voicemail. He said he would be there by 8-9 at the latest. He said he was sorry. He did not hear back. 2 miles away at the same hour, Adrian Kessler was already in her car in the hospital parking garage, answering email on her phone before the building opened. She was 41. Brown blazer, hair back, the kind of face that had learned to show less than it felt because showing less was a form of protection she'd built 1 year at a time since her residency. Her grandfather had founded Kessler Regional in 1971 with 12 beds and a staff of 9. Her father had expanded it. When he had his first stroke 4 years ago, the board had looked at the family name on the building and then at Adrian and offered her the directorship with the particular tone of people who expect to be thanked. She had taken the position without thanking them. She had spent 4 years proving she hadn't needed to be offered it. The head of operations was a man named Gordon Fitch, 54, cocky slacks, the kind of smile that arrived half a beat before anything he said. He had been at Kessler for 22 years. He had expected when Adrian's father declined that the board would look to him. He had been wrong and had spent 4 years being graceful about it in public. That morning at 7:40, he stepped into Adrian's office with a printed personnel summary. He set it on her desk without being asked to sit. One of the ICU care aides hasn't shown up for his shift. Owen Sadler. 3rd absence in 4 months if you count the 2 early departures in September. I flagged this for HR last week. He said it quietly, reasonably, the way he said most things. Adrian looked at the summary. Fitch's name was on the top line. She said, "I'll handle it." Owen arrived at 8:47. He parked, changed quickly in the locker room and walked to the ICU station. Dolores Vega, the charge nurse, was 63 and had been at Kessler since the building had different wallpaper. She looked at the wall clock when he came in. Then she looked at him. She handed him the morning chart without a word. 20 minutes later, the message appeared on the staff terminal. "Dr. Kessler would like to see you." Owen pulled the photograph of Sophie from his badge pocket, the one she'd given him on his first day in this unit, folded in thirds. He put it in his scrub top. Then he walked to the elevator. In the office on the 3rd floor, he sat across from Adrian Kessler, and received the termination with the stillness of a man who has been through things that would have broken a different posture. He did not argue the record. He did not ask her to reconsider. He looked at her for 3 seconds. He nodded once. He left. When the door closed, Adrian picked up her coffee mug and noticed her hand was not entirely steady. "This is what oversight looks like," she told herself. "This is what the board needs to see." She drank the coffee. It had been cold for an hour. By 9:15, Owen was at his locker. He packed a small gym bag, Sophie's photograph, the paperback he kept in the top shelf, a phone charger. He did this in 6 minutes and did not look at the mirror above the sink. The locker room was empty. He walked out through the ground floor corridor. Dolores Vega was standing near the supply closet at the end of the hall. She had not been standing there when he walked in. She did not move when he passed. She stood with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes straight, and when Owen came level with her, she gave him one small nod, the kind that takes practice to give without theatrics. He returned it. Then the door at the end of the hall opened and he was outside. He sat in his truck in the far corner of the lot with the engine off for 40 minutes. He found an envelope in the glove compartment and wrote 3 things on the back: 6 weeks of savings, Sophie's school lunch account, rent through January. He folded the envelope and put it in his chest pocket. He drove to the park at the south end of Millbrook with the small pond that froze early. He sat on a bench at the edge of the water. The sky was the same old chalk color it had been all morning. He did not cry. He had used up a different kind of grief 3 years earlier, in a hospital waiting room that smelled like floor wax, when a doctor had touched his shoulder and said words he already knew were coming. He called Greta and told her Sophie would need to come home to the house after school. He said he had some paperwork to catch up on. He did not say where. At 12:30, Gordon Fitch walked through Adrian's office door and set both palms flat on the edge of her desk. "Clean work," he said. "The board respects decisive management." He smiled. Adrian did not. She looked at the spot on her desk where his palms were and waited until he removed them. That evening, Adrian drove home from a budget review that had run 2 hours over. The roads south of Millbrook were wet from a sleet that had started around 5 and turned to freezing rain by 7. At 8:04, her front right tire found a patch of black ice, where the bridge crossed Shelter Creek. She felt the car go sideways before she could do anything about it. She corrected, overcorrected, and came to rest with the front end angled into the shallow ditch on the right shoulder and the wheels spinning in wet grass. She was unhurt. The car was drivable, she thought, but not from the ditch. She tried reverse. The back wheels threw mud and held nothing. She got out. The rain had not stopped. The shoulder of the road had no light. She stood in her blazer and flagged her phone flashlight at passing cars. A sedan passed, a minivan, a pickup with a contractor's rack, a truck with a boat trailer. She counted without meaning to count 16 vehicles. 17, 18. At 8:22, a truck slowed from the north and pulled onto the shoulder behind her, hazard lights on. The driver's door opened and the man who stepped out was wearing green scrubs and a gray canvas work jacket. The headlights caught him from behind and she saw the shape of his shoulders before she saw his face. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them moved. 3 seconds on the shoulder of a wet road, longer than 3 seconds, the same duration as a closed door and a nod, the same 3 seconds from opposite ends. This time she was the one who had nothing to say. He walked toward her. He did not rush. The walk of a man who had been through worse nights and knew the difference between an emergency and a difficulty. He stopped 2 steps away and looked at the car in the ditch. "How long have you been here?" 15 minutes. Her voice was flatter than she intended. He walked around the car, crouched at the front right tire, stood. He went back to his truck and came back with a tow strap and a work light. "I can pull you out if you steer. It won't take long." She stood in the rain and watched him attach the strap to the undercarriage in a way that suggested he had done this before and not recently for the first time. In 4 minutes, her car was back on the pavement. He coiled the strap without hurry and walked it back to his truck. She should have said thank you and driven away. She had every practical means to do that. "Your jacket," she said instead, because he was soaked through, and she had a wool coat in her back seat she hadn't worn. "It dries," he said. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the road the way men look at a road when they are deciding whether to say something. "Owen," she said his name before she could stop herself. He looked at her then. "I am going to Millbrook," she said it carefully, "if you're going that way." A pause, 3 seconds, the same interval. He had a way of making silence earn its length. "I'm going that way." She followed his truck down the slick road and did not look at her own hands on the wheel. She looked at his hazard lights in front of her, blinking steady in the dark wet, and thought about the personnel summary with Gordon Fitch's name at the top and the way Fitch had put his palms on her desk and said clean work. She did not sleep that night. In the morning she was at her desk by 5:45, with a cup of coffee she did not drink and a question she couldn't stop reforming in different words. The board of Kessler Regional Medical Center met the first Wednesday of each month. On this particular Wednesday, the first board member to arrive was a retired federal judge named Charlotte Wren, who had sat on the board for 11 years. She was 71, compact and careful, the kind of person who read the footnotes. She was passing the staff bulletin board in the main corridor when she stopped. The termination notice was posted in the weekly HR update. Sadler ICU, separation date, reason, attendance. Judge Wren stood at the board for a long moment. Then she went to find Adrian. 6 miles away, at the rental house in Millbrook, Owen was making oatmeal. Sophie sat at the counter with her library book open and one finger keeping her place while she waited for breakfast. He hadn't told her yet. He would tell her tonight, after dinner, once he'd found the right words. He didn't have them yet. He'd been turning the problem over since he woke at 4, and he still didn't have them. In Adrian's office, Charlotte Wren sat across the desk with her hands in her lap. She did not take coffee, she said. "Miss Kessler, the man, whose name is on that termination notice, Owen Sadler. He was a corpsman in the Navy for 8 years. Did you know that? 2 deployments. The second one he came home from with a commendation he didn't put on his application because he decided to let the work speak for itself. I know this because my nephew served on the same ship. Owen Sadler sat with my nephew for 4 hours when his leg was shattered by equipment failure on the deck and there was no other medical personnel available to reach them. My nephew has mentioned his name exactly once to me when I told him I was joining the Kessler board, because he said, 'If you ever see Owen Sadler on a wall somewhere, remember that name. I'm curious about the attendance record you acted on.'" Adrian said nothing for a moment. She pulled the personnel summary from her desk drawer and turned it so Charlotte could read it. Charlotte looked at it. She looked at the name at the top. She set it down. She said, "Before the board meeting, I'd suggest you pull the raw time logs yourself, not the summary. I'd suggest you verify what you have. Your grandfather hired me for this board for the same reason he hired people who were good at their jobs. He believed in looking at the primary source. The summary is not a primary source." She stood, she buttoned her coat. At the door she paused. "Your grandfather," she said, "could read a room. He hired Owen Sadler 18 months ago because he watched him for 12 minutes in a hallway with a patient who spoke no English, and he told your father. That man is what this hospital is supposed to be. I would encourage you to look at what you have before this morning is over." She left. Adrian sat with the sound of the door closing and something cold and specific moving through her. She called the HR administrator and asked for the raw time logs, not the summary, every clock-in record going back 6 months, unformatted. The administrator, a quiet man named Keith who had been there 8 years, arrived in 11 minutes with a printed spreadsheet and a look on his face that Adrian recognized as the expression of someone who has been waiting to be asked. He set the spreadsheet on her desk. He set a second document beside it. "That's the system access log for the attendance module," he said. "The names on it might be relevant." She looked at the time logs first. Owen Sadler had clocked into the ICU unit at an average of 6:58 in the morning over the past 6 months. He had stayed past shift end on 11 separate occasions. He had covered partial shifts for other aides on 3 dates in October that the summary had flagged as absences. The summary lists those 3 dates as no-shows. She looked at the system access log. Gordon Fitch had logged into the attendance database 7 times in the past 3 months. Each access had occurred within hours of submitting a report to her office. She walked to the window. Below her, 3 floors down, the parking lot was filling with the morning shift. She watched a woman in a red coat walk toward the entrance pushing a cart. She thought about Fitch standing in her doorway with his palms flat on the edge of her desk. At 10 o'clock she asked Keith to pull Fitch's vendor disclosures. At 10:30, the hospital's compliance officer had identified a consulting arrangement Fitch had maintained with a medical staffing firm, undisclosed for 14 months. The firm was currently bidding on a contract to provide supplemental ICU staffing, a contract that would render Owen Sadler's entire position, and 8 others like it, redundant by design. Adrian sat at her desk until 7 in the evening, the compliance file on one side, the termination letter she had signed and not yet sent on the other. She did not send the letter. Dolores Vega knocked on her office door the next morning at 6:40. Adrian hadn't gone home. She was wearing yesterday's blazer. The coffee on her desk was the 3rd cup, and none of them had been finished. Dolores came in and sat down without asking, and put a small composition notebook on the desk. The cover was black and the corners were soft from years in a uniform pocket. "I have kept a record since 1994, Dolores said, of every aide, nurse and orderly who worked my unit. Time in, time out notable events. I kept it for the same reason my father kept a ledger for his store, because memory is unreliable and paper is not." She opened the notebook to a page marked with a rubber band. The handwriting was small and vertical and exact. Every shift Owen Sadler had worked in the ICU for 18 months. Every early clock in. 3 dates in October flagged in Fitch's summary as absences. In Dolores' notebook, those 3 dates showed Owen present from 7:15, covering for a night shift aide who had a family emergency, working through to the afternoon audit. "He didn't arrive late on those days," Dolores said. "He had been there since the night before. He finished his shift, and then he worked mine while I handled a situation in the family waiting room that went 3 hours. She paused. She folded her hands on the notebook. "He never mentioned it when the summary came out. I asked him about it directly. He said, if the record doesn't show it, the record is wrong, and records get corrected. He did not say it as a complaint. He said it as a fact he believed was going to happen eventually." Adrian stared at the notebook. "Dolores," she said, "how long have you known about the access log?" "I had a suspicion," Dolores said. "I did not know. I kept the notebook because your grandfather once told me that a good hospital is the kind of place where the truth can be found when someone looks for it. I have been waiting for someone to look." She stood. She picked up the notebook and set it back down on Adrian's desk. "Keep it," she said. "It's a copy. I kept the original at home." At the door she paused the way people in that office kept pausing, the way a room earns pauses when enough truth has moved through it. "He never told me his wife had passed," she said. "I only found out when Sophie drew a picture in the family waiting room one afternoon while he was finishing a shift, and I saw the figures in it. A man, a little girl, and a woman with her arms out, but her feet not touching the ground. I didn't say anything. He saw me notice it. He just looked at me, and I looked at him, and we went back to work. That was the whole conversation." She let herself out. Adrian picked up her phone. She pulled Owen's file. She dialed. He picked up on the second ring. "Sadler. Owen, this is Adrian Kessler. I'd like to come by your home today if that's all right. There are things I need to say to you directly, in person." A pause, 3 seconds. She was beginning to know the specific weight of those 3 seconds. "Sophie gets home from school at 3:15, he said. "After that is fine." He hung up. She held the phone for a moment after the line went quiet. Then she set it on the desk, and for the first time in a long time she sat very still and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Adrian stood on the porch of the rental house on Clover Street in Millbrook. She was holding a manila folder. Inside were a reinstatement offer, a handwritten letter, and the compliance officer's preliminary report on Gordon Fitch. The door opened before she could knock. Sophie stood in the doorway in a purple sweatshirt with a print of a narwhal on the front. She looked at Adrian with the particular scrutiny of a 7-year-old who has been told to answer the door for no one except very specific people. "You were at the park," Sophie said. "You waved at the ducks wrong." Adrian blinked. "I don't know how to wave at ducks." "You wave low," Sophie demonstrated, "not high. It scares them." She took Adrian's hand and pulled her inside. The house was small and orderly and warm in the way that small houses become warm when someone has worked at it. A low bookshelf full of Sophie's library books and Owen's medical texts side by side without category. A kitchen table with 2 chairs and a third one angled slightly out from the wall that might have been recently added. On the refrigerator, held with magnets shaped like states, were drawings in a careful grid. Most of them showed 3 figures. A tall man, a small girl, a woman with her arms extended. One drawing taped in the center, newer paper, brighter crayon showed two figures in a boat on a pond. Owen came out of the kitchen with a dish towel. He looked at Adrian and then at his daughter's hand in Adrian's hand. He said, "Dr. Kessler." She said, "Adrian." He gestured at the table. She sat. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor and opened a drawing pad and began working on something without announcing what. "Owen," Adrian said. The attendance records were falsified. All 3 dates in October. Fitch accessed the database directly each time within hours of submitting the summary to my office. He also has an undisclosed financial arrangement with the staffing firm bidding on the ICU contract. A contract that would have eliminated your position by design. She slid the manila folder across the table. He did not pick it up. "I came here," she said, "because you deserve to hear the apology from the person responsible, in your own home, not in a hallway or a conference room with other people watching. I was given a document and I acted on it without verifying it. That is on me. I don't have a way to undo the day, but I would like to try to account for it honestly." Owen looked at her for a long moment. The same 3 seconds. She was starting to understand that they weren't silence, they were thought. He said, "I'll make coffee." He went to the kitchen. Sophie looked up from her drawing pad and patted the floor beside her. Adrian Kessler, who had presented to hospital boards and chaired budget sessions and once testified in front of a Senate subcommittee on rural health care, sat down on the floor of a small rental house in Millbrook, New Jersey. Sophie showed her each drawing in order. The tall man was Dad. The woman with her arms extended was Mom, who lived somewhere you couldn't visit but could still talk to if you knew how. Sophie had been drawing all 3 of them for 3 years. Last month she had started drawing only 2. She hadn't told her dad. "How come?" Adrian asked. Sophie thought about this, the way children think about things they've already made a decision about. "Dad gets sad when he sees the 3 of us and I'm not there," she said. "If I'm there too, then he doesn't have to be sad in front of me. I'm working on it." Adrian held that sentence for a moment. She did not have anything to say that was better than the sentence. From the kitchen came the sound of water, and then the sound of a cabinet opening, and then the particular sound of a man moving carefully in a small space so as not to make too much noise. Owen came back with 2 mugs of coffee and set one on the table by the manila folder he still hadn't touched. He sat down on the floor next to his daughter. He looked at the drawing she was working on. He did not comment on it. He handed her a red crayon she hadn't asked for and she took it without looking up. The 3 of them stayed on the floor until the coffee was cold. Sophie fell asleep against Owen's arm at some point between her 3rd story about a girl in her class who could whistle with her fingers and a 4th story she didn't finish. He shifted her gently and she didn't wake. He looked at Adrian over the top of his daughter's head. "You didn't have to come in person," he said. "I know," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He did not need to. The board of Kessler Regional Medical Center met the following Wednesday at 7 in the morning. Charlotte Wren was already seated when Gordon Fitch arrived in a new tie and a blazer with a pocket square he had not been wearing the previous week. He sat at Adrian's right and smiled at her as she took her chair. She looked at the table. "Before we move to the capital expenditure review," Adrian said, "I have a personnel and compliance matter to bring before this board." She nodded to the projector. The first slide was the raw time months. The second slide was the system access log. 7 entries, 1 administrative account, each one within hours of a report submission. The third slide was the account name. The fourth slide was the composition notebook, a photograph of Dolores Vega's handwriting, each line a date and time in small vertical print covering 18 months of an ICU unit. The fifth slide was Gordon Fitch's undisclosed consulting arrangement. The sixth slide was the staffing firm's bid, the timeline of the contract, and the projected headcount reduction. Fitch said the notebook was inadmissible, and the access log could have been anyone. The door at the back of the room opened. Owen walked in first. He was in a clean navy Henley and dark pants. His hands were clasped behind his back in a posture that belonged to a different uniform. Behind him came Dolores Vega in her charge nurse's badge, her composition notebook under one arm and a second notebook under the other. Behind her came Charlotte Wren, who had stepped out 8 minutes earlier to make a call she had described only as personal business. Judge Wren did not sit down. She stood at the back of the room. She said in the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years making courtrooms listen, Dolores Vega has maintained contemporaneous records of ICU staffing for 29 years. In any court I have presided over, that notebook is a document. I will state for the record that I consider it one here. I will also state for the record that I know the character of the man whose name is on that termination notice, and that I am prepared to speak to it at length to any party that wishes to revisit this board's judgment. Fitch stood up. 2 board members beside him did not look at him. The vote was 7-1, termination for cause. The compliance officer walked to Fitch and asked for his badge. Fitch looked at Adrian. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He set his badge on the table. He walked out. He passed Dolores in the doorway, and Dolores looked at the wall above his head, and he was gone. Margaret, Keith's colleague from HR, who had been standing quietly in the hall, came in and set a file on the table in front of Adrian. Owen's complete personnel record, every commendation from his Navy service, every performance review from the 18 months at Kessler, each one rated above standard. Every note Dolores had written about him in 18 months of care logs. Owen had remained at the back of the room the whole time. He stood with his hands clasped, the posture of a man who has learned that patience is not the same as surrender. When the room cleared, he looked at Adrian across the oval table. She looked back at him. She nodded once. He nodded back. Neither of them spoke. The board members gathered their papers around them and did not notice. What passed between the two of them was not for the room. 5 weeks passed. The first real cold came to Millbrook in December and stayed. Owen was reinstated as lead care aide in the ICU, and given the case coordination role that had been unfilled for 7 months. He kept driving the same 12-year-old Nissan. He kept eating lunch in the break room with the night shift nurses who came off at noon. Dolores's second notebook, the original she had kept at home, was framed and hung in the corridor outside the ICU with a small brass plaque that Adrian had ordered without discussing it with anyone. On a Saturday in mid-December, Sophie Sadler had her first solo showing at the Millbrook Community Arts Space. It was part of the after-school program's year-end exhibit. 6 children's work on the gymnasium walls. Sophie had 4 pieces. She had sent the invitation herself. She had used the school printer and an envelope she had addressed with a pencil in careful block letters to Dr. Adrian Kessler, Kessler Regional Medical Center, 3rd floor. At the bottom in small lowercase letters she had written, "Please don't tell my dad I invited you." Adrian arrived 10 minutes early. She was wearing the camel blazer she'd had dry cleaned twice since the night on the road. Owen saw her from across the gymnasium. His face did the small thing it did, the brief pause that wasn't surprise but was something. He didn't walk over. Sophie did. Sophie took her hand and led her to the wall where her 4 pieces hung. The first 3 were exactly what you'd expect. A horse, a map of her street, a self-portrait, with one ear slightly larger than the other. The 4th was new, 3 figures standing at the edge of a pond, a tall man, a small girl, and a woman standing slightly apart. The woman had one hand extended, not quite reaching the other 2, not retreating, just not yet. Sophie didn't say who the woman was. Adrian didn't ask. After the exhibit, they walked along the creek path at the edge of town. Owen kept his hands in his jacket pockets. Sophie ran ahead to look at something in the water and came back certain she had seen a crayfish and unwilling to be told otherwise. Owen knelt and confirmed it without having seen it. Adrian watched him do this, the effortless gentleness of a man who had chosen it deliberately, every day, regardless of what the day had done to him first. At one point, walking in a quiet stretch, Owen said half to himself, "Mara used to say December was the only honest month, everything stripped back so you could see the actual shape of things." He didn't say anything more. Adrian didn't ask him to. She looked at the creek, which was running low and clear over smooth brown stones, and she thought that she was beginning to understand what honest looked like. At the parking lot, Sophie ran ahead to the Nissan. Owen stopped at the path's edge. He looked at Adrian. He almost said something. She could see the sentence form and then release without arriving. He said, "Drive carefully. The bridge at Shelter Creek is better than it was, but give it some space at night." She said, "I know the bridge." He almost smiled. He didn't. He followed his daughter to the car. Sophie called something back about hot chocolate that had more logistical detail than a 7-year-old should have been capable of generating. Adrian stood in the parking lot with her coat buttoned and watched the Nissan pull out and watched the taillights until they were gone. She stood there longer than she needed to. By March, the ice on Shelter Creek had run out, and the birches along Clover Street were pushing their small, tight buds. Owen had signed the lease on a house 3 blocks from Sophie's school, the one with the back porch that needed work and the yard large enough for a garden. He was fixing the porch on Sunday afternoons. He had an opinion about it that involved taking his time. On the second Sunday in March, Adrian pulled up to the house in the white Forester she'd had since before the Range Rover that had gone into the ditch on the bridge road. She had a flat of seedlings in her back seat. Tomatoes and 1 sugar snap pea she'd bought on advice from the woman at the nursery, who had asked her what the sun situation was and accepted her answer even though it was not an expert answer. Sophie had texted her on Wednesday. "Dad says you grew tomatoes in college. Is that true? Can you bring some?" Adrian had not grown tomatoes in college. She had grown tomatoes for exactly 1 semester and abandoned them when her 4th-year rotation started. She considered this close enough. She and Sophie planted the flat along the south fence while Owen washed the lunch dishes through the kitchen window. Sophie packed the soil with both palms like she was patting something that needed reassurance. She did each one the same way. She did not rush any of them. Owen came out at some point and stood on the back porch with a mug of coffee watching them. He did not say anything. He stood there the way a man stands when he has decided that watching is what the moment requires, and he is sufficient to it. Nobody named what the Sundays were. There had been no declaration, no specific conversation, no moment with formal edges. Adrian came on Sundays. Sometimes she stayed for dinner. Once she had helped Sophie with a book report, and once Owen had fixed the handle on the window in her kitchen because he had been there when she mentioned it and he'd brought a screwdriver the following week without being asked. Sophie had set the table for 3 one evening without looking up from what she was doing, the way you set a table for 3 when you've stopped counting whether it's usual. Charlotte Wren had retired from the board in February. At her retirement dinner she had found Adrian near the window by the coats, and had put one brief hand on her arm. "Your grandfather would have said you got there the right way," she said, "and he would have meant the whole year, not just the boardroom." That afternoon, when the last tomato seedling was in, Sophie stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees and looked at Adrian with the focused expression of a child who has been thinking about a question for a while. "Are you coming back next Sunday?" Adrian looked at the kitchen window. Owen was inside, his back to them, rinsing the mug. She watched him for a moment. He turned and saw her through the glass. He gave the small nod, the same nod from the 3rd-floor office, and the shoulder of the bridge road and the back of the boardroom. She gave it back. "Yeah," she said to Sophie, "I'll be back." That evening the 3 of them sat at the kitchen table with the window over the sink open 2 inches to the March air. Owen sliced bread. Sophie explained, in detail, the structural problems she had identified in her school's tetherball pole. Adrian passed the butter without being asked. Sophie had put a candle on the table. She had lit it herself because she had said the kitchen looked too new. The light was yellow and ordinary, and it made the window glass a dark mirror where you could see, if you were paying attention, 3 people sitting down to a meal. No one said anything that needed saying out loud. Owen filled Sophie's water glass. Adrian reached for the salt. Sophie laughed at something that had nothing to do with either of them. Outside on the south fence, the tomato seedlings stood in their new soil and waited for what April would decide to give them. Nobody was watching them grow. That was the only way to be sure they actually would. I keep thinking about the toe strap. Not the boardroom. Not the vote. Not Fitch setting his badge on the table and walking out without finishing his sentence. I keep thinking about Owen Sadler in the rain on the shoulder of a road, crouching at the undercarriage of a car that belonged to the woman who had ended his livelihood 12 hours earlier, attaching a strap with the calm hands of someone who simply knew how to do the thing that needed doing. He didn't pause to calculate whether she deserved it. He didn't rehearse what he would say when she recognized him. He just did the work, and I think that's the part that stays with me. Because most of us, if we're being honest, would have slowed down, seen her face, and kept driving. We would have told ourselves it was justice. We would have called it even. Owen didn't, and that's not a small thing. That's actually the whole thing. There's a version of this story where Owen is just unlucky, A decent man caught in a bad system, waiting for someone to fix it. But that's not what happened. What happened is that Owen had spent years building the kind of character that doesn't require an audience. He showed up 12 hours early on the days the record marked him absent. He sat with Dolores's patients when the waiting room was empty and no one was counting. He kept Sophie's photograph folded in his badge pocket every single shift, not as a reminder of why he needed the job, but as a reminder of what the job was supposed to mean. That kind of consistency is not luck. It's a choice made quietly, over and over, until it becomes the shape of who you are. And because he had made that choice, the truth about him was recoverable. Dolores had her notebook. Keith had the access log. Charlotte Wren had a name her nephew had spoken exactly once, years ago, because some things don't need to be repeated to be remembered. The record existed because Owen had been worth keeping a record of. That's the part I want to hold on to. Not that good people get rewarded. That's not always true, and I don't think Owen would have said it either, but that integrity accumulates. Every day you do the right thing when no one is watching, you are building something. You are making the truth about yourself harder to erase. Fitch could edit a database. He could not edit Dolores Vega's handwriting in a composition notebook she had kept for 29 years. He could not edit the memory of a federal judge whose nephew had survived because of the hands of a man in green scrubs who stayed when he didn't have to. Adrian's part in this matters too, in a different way. She made a bad call. She acted on a summary without checking the source, under pressure from people who were watching her to see if she would blink. And then, when the truth came to her, she didn't manage it from a distance. She drove to a small house on Clover Street and sat down on the floor next to a 7-year-old and said, in her own words, without an audience, "I was wrong, and you deserved better." That took something. Not genius. Not power. Just the willingness to be accountable in a room where accountability cost her something real. Sophie drew a woman standing slightly apart, one hand extended, not quite reaching, not retreating, just not yet. I think about that drawing a lot, about what it means to extend a hand before you're certain it will be taken, about how the things that actually last, between people inside a life, are almost never announced. They accumulate the same way integrity does, one Sunday at a time. One plate set for 3 without discussion, one candle lit because the table looked too new. The tomato seedlings were planted in March. Nobody watched them grow. That's not carelessness. That's trust.